Well, welcome everybody to this session that we're grateful that Miro has convened such a great space for us to have this conversation. We met a little bit yesterday and got to talk about all the changes in the industry. So again, my name is Paul Carlisle. I'm a professor at Boston University, teach there at the business school. I'm probably the oldest person in the room. I've been studying product development or participating in product development or leading product development for about 40 years. And it's tough to keep up on all the changes. And so with that, I'm going to start with Tamara and then Anola and then Jonah. They'll introduce themselves, their background, and their roles in their companies.
Well, thank you, Paul, and it's great to be here and to see all of you. I love the yellow. It's awesome. So my name is tamari Yosua. I lead product and technology at Glean. For those of you who don't know what Glean is a work AI platform where we understand the context of your organization, we ingest information from all of your SaaS apps, and then help you find information, summarize it, generate content based on it, and take action. So we're in the world of AI, and prior to that, I led product at Slack.
Thank you. My name is Eniola Oluwale. I'm a lifelong designer. I currently lead design, content, and user experience at Northwestern Mutual, the largest life insurance company in the United States, and then also they provide financial planning. Before that, I was head of design and user research at Gap.
Great. Hi, everyone. I am Jonah Moore. I am Chief Technology Officer at MetaLab. We basically are a digital design, product, and engineering company. Our clients have included Slack, actually, Uber, Coinbase, and we recently have gotten really into the AI space, doing Midjourney Rooms and Suno AI, the music creator app. And so for us, we are launching products every day, so it's exciting to be here.
So speed's going to be, I think, one of our themes here today, but this idea of how do we master these new dynamics is the big challenge that we're all trying to figure out. And plus what we also saw about 2 hours ago is one of those attempts to help us master it, but how do we begin to change our workflows, et cetera. So this question here of how do we think about managing these overall innovation dynamics, and maybe we'll start with Tamar in terms of how in her role, how is she working with that?
It's hard to talk about innovation today without talking about AI, and especially because I work at a company that's building AI products. You wake up in the morning and you look at the news, and there's 10 new companies who started doing things that they all sound the same. Like the websites all look the same, and then by the end of the day, there are 10 more. So how do you keep up with that? I think with the question of how do you innovate, and how do you really innovate in something that's useful for your customers. And a friend of mine who's at a startup, he said that they had a channel, a Slack channel, that was looking at everything competitors in the industry, and his co-founder deleted the channel and told him he wasn't allowed to look at it anymore because it was too distracting. So that's kind of a theme of like, you have to focus on your customer to innovate what they need, not looking at your competitors and what they're doing. However, the big thing that I would say is that we have to work faster. That it is, and we have more tools now to work faster. So you need to adopt those new tools to be able to code faster, to design faster, to collaborate faster, and you have to really keep up, because if you don't, you're going to be obsolete.
The question of keeping up, et cetera, is a big challenge for us. And from your perspective and your role that you've been serving in, what are some of the challenges?
I think the interesting thing about my role is that I think both from the perspective of how does my team innovate in the creation of their work product, but then also how does the company itself innovate. I think for my team, you always want innovation to happen. That's how you create product that stands out from all the other products out there, and that's how you get those ideas that get sort of 10x or 5x, whatever the improvement you're trying to see from your team. I think you want to make sure that you're creating space for them to innovate. You can't innovate on sort of super tight timelines and not having the space to either take in research or explore concepts before you refine down. I think at the company level, what I also see happening is the shift from maybe innovation as a side hustle of like, do what you're doing normally, but find some way to innovate in sort of your normal workday, to really innovation being a more funded or dedicated work stream, especially with the emergence of AI. So now there's sort of a focus and a funding for how do we innovate, but it's a tighter lens around innovation with AI at the core.
Yeah, so I think the particular challenge of maybe an enterprise, a larger, you mentioned the kind of the startup context, what does that speed feel like? But in an enterprise context, how do you plan for that? Because you still got to do speed, but you got to collaborate more, coordinate more. I mean, those are kind of big challenges there, so.
I'm curious if I can ask you, as somebody who is looking at innovating faster with AI, and as from the lens of we're selling products to help you innovate faster with AI, how do you evaluate them? How do you look at those products? How do you decide?
So again, I look at it two lenses. For my team, I really look to see is the processes that AI is either saving us time, are they creating meaningful output? So for example, we might use AI to help generate explores on what a possible solution is, either from wireframes or designs, or from a content perspective, different approaches to prose and copy. We still need our designers and content writers to still evaluate that and take that work product and create meaningful output. But then we evaluate the products to say, hey, does this really save us time? Is the quality there? Or is this a step that we're just going through because it's AI and the value isn't really realized?
So that becomes a significant opportunity as kind of we use AI. But other observations about how this overall arching process of innovation is changing that you're struggling with or seeing other clients struggling with, or anybody else?
Yeah, I'll say, because we have both startup and enterprise clients, I think the launch and the speed is a thing. It's a really big thing. But then also there are tighter budgets and leaner teams. And so you have to do a lot more, it feels like, with less. And so it is actually leveraging these tools to take away a lot of the redundancy. So we're using it in our design process. We're using Midjourney to help us, maybe concept and, do sketches really quickly. We're using things for, like Waldo to do competitive research and do that quite quickly. We're using all the voice tools to help us synthesize information quite quickly. We're using Miro to collaborate, and then we're using Copilot for development as well. So now it just feels like it's totally sort of changed our workflow.
Yeah. And so in some ways we've heard this description of some of the silos that make that harder, but now we have to go at such a speed. How do we do the integration? What's the role of the project manager, let alone what's the role of the AI in facilitating that faster and faster? What are some of the things you've seen about that? Is it the project managers, program managers using this more? What kind of advantages are you seeing there?
It's interesting, I think, with the advent of more of these tools, the roles and the lines between the roles are kind of blurring, in that you can get a product manager who can do better designs in Figma because of Figma AI, or you can even get a PM who's going to write prototypes because they can use ChatGPT to generate the code, or Copilot, and then get something up and running that they couldn't have done before. So I do believe that over time these roles are going to blur a little bit, and they're going to also work much more closely together. We're already seeing it. We're seeing it in the pace with which you can get information. Instead of having user researchers go and talk to lots of customers, you can get it through AI tools. There's one company that I talked to recently that has AI talking to customers to do user research. And there was a really interesting observation that some people prefer to talk to an AI to give feedback because then they're not insulting somebody about the product they're building. And it's like, whoa, never would have thought of that. So some of the things as you talk to a lot of these companies doing stuff, you just don't realize and you don't think about it. And to your point of like blurring the lines, so one person needs to try it and then talk about it, and then a second person is like, So somebody in our team, a product manager, built a prompt that analyzes customer calls and looks through the transcripts and then puts it in a spreadsheet the top requested features. And that's something that would have taken like days to listen to all these calls, transcribe them. But it's so easy to do. Now anyone can do it. Like an engineer can do it. There's a prompt that you just click go and Glean, and you get the results. So people in other functions are doing more of this than they were before, and that's a really cool thing to see.
It almost feels a little bit like instead of waiting for something to be done. We can do now set up experiments much more rapidly, but then maybe we can pass that experiment onto so you're passing an experiment along, not just the outcome or something like that. So it seems to be there's a lot more curiosity being potentially built into what we're doing.
I think also what I see is that there's that curiosity and there's that desire for exploration. I think on the flip side, the challenge there is that people are still used to working in their current ways of working or their prior ways of working. And what I've seen when we've adopted AI in various circumstances is teams have, gone through the first rev or first V1 of their AI project. And then when we do a review, we've identified, either inconsistencies in output or not the right quality of output that we wanted. And when we look back at it, what we realized we didn't do is talk about how do we want to work with this new thing? Yeah. And I think the challenge is it is a new way of working in terms of new roles from a development standpoint, new technologies that people are using, and individually people might know their subject matter expertise, but how they interface with each other and sort of make sure that they're aligned and communicating is different. So I think it's important as that exploration around AI happens, or innovation really, is making sure we're talking maybe up front of what are the commitments we're making to each other and how are we staying in sync and collaborating is supremely important.
Yeah, I think one of my fears is we're moving so fast that sometimes you lose that collaboration and you lose that empathy. So in terms of designers and engineers, working together and working out maybe some of their differences that they used to have in a team environment, it's how do you make sure when you're moving that fast that you can still create relationships in a team? Because a team at the end of the day is what's really delivering the product. It's how well they work together.
This kind of speed of this paradox of speed, because sometimes you can say it takes time to save time, but this may look different. What is that going to look like in this new environment where the AI is allowing you to go so much quicker? I mean, what are some of the struggles, and maybe that's how do you reset that culture of a place? Because you've talked about how the teams have their existing culture. They may be afraid of this speed. You've talked a little bit about some of your engineers struggling with that. How do you get them to experiment with it in a way that brings them up to speed? What are some of the things that you're doing?
I think we're doing a lot of learning and development, and I think we're trying to do it more cross-discipline, so it's not like engineers are only learning one thing, designers are only learning one thing, product managers. It's now actually understanding the entire product innovation lifecycle and knowing all these tools, because as you mentioned, there's a tool every 5 minutes. So how do you make sure you're sharing your knowledges, you're sharing your lessons learned, and that you're taking that and advancing how you work in a more productive way?
Yeah.
I think one of the things we have to realize is with new products, it's not just a technological change, it's a behavior change. Yeah. So with Glean, when we roll out Glean to a customer, you see some people adopt it really quickly. They're like, we call them the AI curious. The first phase is, AI, go away, you're going to take away my job, I don't want to have anything to do with you. And then the second phase is, oh, this is interesting, I've heard about it. And then you start using it, and then you start becoming a champion. And that journey for companies starts with the journey for employees. So first you need to give somebody a concrete use case that is going to make their life better. And I really believe even the AI tools that exist in production today are being way underutilized. So it's not that we have to do more, we have to use, the companies and the products like us need to keep innovating and moving forward, but if you're in a company using these tools, use something like, talk to people in your team and say, what are you using? Like this example that I used from a product manager, saving time by getting a list of feature requests. I guarantee you there are people in your company who are doing that today. Find them and figuring out what they do. One of the things that we did in the product is trying to enable people to create prompts, save them and share them. And then if you're in a team, you're an engineer, and there's another engineer in your team using a prompt, then you will see that. It will surface for you. So to proactively say, hey, there's somebody else using a prompt to review pull requests, for example. And so then you help people through that journey to not be scared of it, to see that it's actually going to make them more productive. So that behavior change, for me, it's for our customers as much as it is internally.
Yeah. So I see kind of a role as leaders, managers. How do I cherry pick? Maybe I got to understand your pain points and recommend that tool, because there's almost, I'm hearing like an individual journey, But then, Jonah, then there's this collective thing, because if they just take it to their own little place, maybe they don't fully learn the lesson. So there's an individual journey, but there's this collective journey, because you can see more, right? You can integrate more, and that seems to be, how to allow that speed to be both a collective benefit. I mean, where are you at in that kind of struggle? Because that's, as a leader, you're trying to manage both those things, adoption at the individual level, but kind of this breadth of adoption.
Got to lead by example.
Yeah.
So I think that's the most important thing. We had the same thing with behavior change for Slack when customers would use Slack. You want the executives using it, sending all their messages, then they understand that this is the new platform. Same with AI. If you're a leader, then you craft a message with ChatGPT, with Glean, whatever, and you say at the bottom, written with the help of this AI tool. Or even if if any role you have, if you're proud of it, and you say, this is what I'm using to make my job more effective, then other people will follow, as opposed to doing it on the sly and pretending like you're not supposed to be using these tools.
Yeah, actually, sorry. No, I was just, in terms of thinking about, we're talking a lot about the work, but I think what we need to do is get people back to the products that they're making. Make sure that they're focusing on the user, they're focusing on what is the challenge you're trying to solve with these products, and making sure that it stands out. There's a lot of AI tools. What are the differentiators of those tools, and how do you make sure the thing that you're making is going to have a lasting impression on users so that they'll stay engaged?
So not for a tool's sake, but still with that, the end point in mind, things like that. And Anola, in the new role that you're in, I mean, you're kind of newer to this organization, so in some ways you're having, because you've kind of been in your cultures for a while, but the particular challenges of you leading in a newer organization, this kind of behavioral change, let alone tool change, what are some of the things that you're learning that you can share with us?
I think, the interesting thing is every organization has a different footprint of technology and experiences. Just piggybacking on the last conversation, it's being really intentional about what tools you adopt. On the content creators, so design, content, research perspective, there are a lot of tools out there, and I'll just use Big D as design. Design always wants to explore new tools, right? And the challenge is, one, you want to maybe centralize on core tools so you can get scale with your team, right? If everyone's sort of using the same tools, then it's really easy to bring on new people. You can share learnings, etc. If everyone's exploring a different tool and having that be a core part of their work process, there's a lot of disruption there. So I like to have the mentality of like, hey, let's explore and like identify the problem that we're trying to solve. Then let's identify a few people to then explore that tool against that problem, and then come back with a recommendation. Then let's decide to use this tool versus more of a free-for-all where it's no holds barred, and we don't really have a firm process because everyone is doing something in a slightly different way.
Yeah, because I think a lot of environments, there's that lead user who's just going to go do it, but you don't want to restrain them. But how do you provide that kind of collaborative approach to kind of learning that? So.
One thing I heard recently which resonated with me, that even though writing prompts is not technical, anybody can write a prompt. People who understand what AI can and can't do, who are more technically inclined, are actually better at figuring out what prompts to write. So we had at Glean, before we launched our prompt saving, we did a promptathon within the company. And where we took a day and we had every function, sales, marketing, engineering, write prompts in the product in Glean to say, here's what you can do with the product. But what we did with this one is we seeded in every team an engineer or a product manager, with the salespeople, with the marketing people, and we had it pretty narrow, the functions, not just sales, but like sales operations and SMBs and enterprise, because they all were different. But seeding it with somebody who understood the technology and how to work with these prompts actually supercharged the promptathon. And then we had prizes, and one of the prompts that won was the sales team did a prompt to unblock deals. So if a deal, they were blocked, they put it in, and it could read all the data from Salesforce. And then we have a channel that's called wins, which every sales deal that closes, people say how they closed it. It went and looked at all the wins from all of the deals, identified deals that had been blocked in similar ways of the current deal that was blocked, and came up with suggestions. That was so cool. And now our sales team is actually using this, and this came out of the Promptathon. So it goes back to having leadership dedicate time, say this is okay, this is what you should be doing, but the seating with somebody who's more familiar with the product and technology was an insight that somebody else gave me that I hadn't thought about.
So even sometimes we don't always think about sales in this way, but what closes the deal or not? Can that dish that up rather quickly in a breadth of expertise? And I'm hearing it from the EA. I'm not hearing it from somebody who just closed the deal and I didn't. So it has those kinds of advantages too. Maybe just getting back to the question of in the earlier presentation, we talked a little bit about the notion of discovery, design, and delivery. So kind of the 3 phases of that. So in some ways, we have different cycles, we have different kinds of technical talent, we have different people have different inclinations. I mean, that also has to be the thing we manage. How do we seed it across all those groups? And Jonah, you had kind of mentioned that you want to have this integrated approach. You don't want people to, separate themselves off. I mean, how do you bring people together across all those phases, or when do you do that?
Yeah, I think it's important to bring the teams together to work towards what is the common goal. So when we're designing a product, we need to make sure the designers, the product teams, the engineers understand what is the problem we're solving, what is the vision, what are the metrics, what are the things that we are working towards. So, the designer isn't just designing something because it looks really cool. You have a product manager who's prioritizing only revenue, and then you have an engineer who's, I hate to say it because they're probably listening right now, just kind of cranking through tickets, right? So, but it's like, how do you make sure they're all understanding, like, hey, we're working towards this one thing? And for us, we have like shared, Slack channels. We make sure that we're doing, we're understanding, we're testing together constantly. We're working together. It's about building those relationships so that as a team, you're working like a machine. I think that's really important.
Otherwise, the fragmentation makes things very difficult. Of course, now we're back to the question, does the AI help in the workflow around where that fragmentation might be the strongest, where the pain points might be the biggest? Maybe what are some of the biggest pain points, Anola, what you kind of dealt with this kind of approach?
I think the thing that I see happen a lot is when organizations want to innovate, especially around AI, it becomes a special project and then a special team, and then they sort of go into a closet and then do their AI thing and then come back and they're like, look at this really cool thing that we did. And everybody's like, but you left us back at home while you were on vacation. So I think what I want to make sure that teams are doing when they're innovating around AI is like, how do you have that regular cadence that shouldn't go longer than 2 weeks, where everyone is not necessarily a direct influencer, but at least they're aware of where they're going with that particular project. I work in a lot of enterprise organizations where a solution is really across the organization, and there are multiple stakeholders that are necessary in terms of the customer experience, the business logic, the systems, etc. So a small team doesn't have actually the visibility of the large organization, so you need those regular touch points to make sure that you're capturing that input to make a successful solution. At the same time, you need really clear ways of working, and I hate to use the word governance, but we'll just say ways of working, to make sure that team isn't slowed down, right? Mm-hmm. Because the challenge with a large organization is that you get that bureaucracy that comes with the organization, and then your innovation project now gets sort of de-scoped and gets smaller and smaller and doesn't really realize its full potential. So you really need a clear sponsor or sponsors and clear guide rails of like, what are the key driving tenets for that team so they can move fast and unblock when that organization starts bearing down on them.
Yeah. And I think in the conversation earlier today, that, AI is in the, it's in the ether, not only out there, but right here in the room. And this question of cutting edge technologies, and kind of one thing that's come out of this is there's both the breadth I have to manage, but then the depth of that. And Tamara, in some ways, you're a company who has to fully engage with that, both in terms of internally how you do that, but also that's the product you're providing.
Yeah. So I very much believe that AI is just a technology, and all companies that are developing products, you still have to develop a product that fits a user need, and you're solving a real problem. So I think there was a period of time where it's like, ooh, cool technology, what can I do with it? Let me just throw it at the wall and try a bunch of things. But now everybody's realizing that you're solving a real problem, and it enables you to solve problems that you couldn't solve before. And that's really amazing. So the breadth of things you can do is so much bigger. But soon there will be no AI companies. Everyone will just be using AI as a technology layer like you use cloud as a technology layer. It's not going to be any different. So we just need to stick to our principles that you're solving real problems. But AI as a technology layer creates different issues in how you solve problems. So when you're building products using LLMs, we've never built products based on technologies that were non-deterministic. That's a new thing. And when you go to ChatGPT and you ask a question and it gets kind of wrong or it changes its answer, you kind of laugh and like, oh, that was cute. But you're a CIO who just spent $1 million on software that you get non-deterministic answers. You don't think that's cute anymore. So we have to figure out as software providers, how do we put guardrails in place? How do we set expectations? So that's a big difference in how we work, is understanding that this technology requires a different way of communicating in the product, requires a different level of training, requires different guardrails in making sure that how do you test the answers. When I go to these like dinners in San Francisco with people, AI builders, the first question that comes up by everyone is like, how do you eval these products? So as people using them and also consulting with other people using them, this to me is the difference that we're figuring out. But as long as we stay grounded in the customer, that all the communication and everything in the teams really is the same, it's just moving faster.
Yeah. So in some ways, the customer grounds the non-deterministic, and how do you create opportunities to do that? And whether it's, because what we do, it's a distributed semantic, right? That's kind of the big AI. But then how do we think, what's our semantic with the customer? What's most important? How do we make sure we're grounded in that? And I think in some ways it almost means we have to double down on that versus retreating and letting the cloud take care of it, right? Just as a storage device. It's doing more than that. So that becomes a big challenge. And as a leader, we kind of talked about how we set that mark, but
I think ultimately your end customer determines the success or not of your product. I had an experience a few months ago where we were releasing an AI product. In our first run, we thought it was pretty good, and then we did some user research, and we highlighted that we were talking about people's bodies to some degree versus the product that the people were wearing. And that was in our process that we're still ironing out a big wake-up call of, we really need tenets and guidelines around what a successful outcome is. And that came from research and talking to people that are core users of our product, both from the business and also from the customer perspective, and distilling them down into tenets of like, what is a successful outcome? What is a successful review? And then using, or the team using that as an evaluation for the outcome of the product. And I think that was something that you generally have project tenets or guides, or you do user research. But I see more and more as AI projects come, having those very clearly defined rules of what a successful outcome looks like to guide the team, both design, engineering, product, etc., around the evaluation of the work they're doing is even more important because the machine, you'll only be able to see a subset of what those responses are, but when it's working at sort of full tilt, it's generating, depending on your audience set, thousands or hundreds or millions of results. And you need those rules and guidelines in place to make sure that the results that are being put out are right for all your end clients.
yeah. And Jonah, you mentioned kind of earlier that, this customer focus, we're hearing it from all three of you, but you also mentioned that some organizations are decreasing their design budgets. And there's this question, is this tool replaced? Does it do that? But in some ways we're hearing like, this is, sometimes I think about AI as a mirror you look in and it reveals things, right? And so in other words, if we're not really focused on the customer, it's going to reveal that to us. And so how do we keep that customer focus alive when maybe people think I'm going to lower cost through this technology? How do you manage that?
Yeah, well, for us, we do a lot of testing, and I have a lot of clients they want to release as soon as possible. And when I mean as soon as possible, sometimes it's in, a couple weeks. And I'm like, okay, we have no platform, and we're going to, try to release something very quickly. But a lot of times it is getting something, I believe in actually doing the user research and, making sure you understand what you're designing for, but then getting it into the hands of users as fast as possible. So we do a lot of testing with our products, with our clients, with their customers, to make sure we're getting that feedback and to make sure it's resonating so we can quickly pivot, especially as competitors, come beside them. It's how can you make sure you're responding to the customer, but then also respond to the competitor that is coming around the corner, and making sure that you're developing something that is that's going to stand out in market, and is going to be differentiated, and is going to stand the test of time.
And maybe a cost orientation that might remind, that clarity there says it's the customer, but also the competition, right? If I can take care of the customer, I'm also addressing the competition. So that maybe helps keep that kind of spotlight on those two things, so it's not just a way to reduce cost or that type of thing, customer first. So any other observations about some of the pressures that you're seeing around some people in the organization maybe misunderstanding what AI is? Again, they may think about cloud, it's going to reduce storage costs. If you think about those previous kind of CIO kind of transitions in technology, how do you make sure we get that information out there? What's the best, as a product person who cares about design?
I think a lot of people think it's a magic bullet. So you get an empty box, and it's like, what should my priority be for this week? Well, it's hard for us to tell you what your priority should be if you haven't told us what you're working on. And so there's some things that there's just isn't an understanding of what the product can and can't do. And that's on us as product developers on how do you educate people and say, here's some things you should try. And here's some things that are going on in your organization you should know about. So it's being more proactive in telling people what it does and doesn't do. And if you think about when Google search first started and you had to put in a query, nobody knew what a query was. Nobody knew how to search. It was a different language. And then over time, now everybody knows how to query. And you know how to refine a query. And you know how to use suggest in queries, because it's just a part of our vernacular. We're just starting with AI and with chatbots. With a chat box of an empty box. So now it's going to expand to beyond just a box. It's going to be expanding to other things so that we help users understand what they can and can't do. And we put it more into their daily lives and make it relevant and put it in front of them when they need it, and not make them have to go and find it. I think that's a really important distinction. Soon, every productivity suite will have AI built into it. It'll just be, you won't even remember a day where you didn't have a little sparkle or a little wand that said generate. Everything will do that. Now it's still novel, but those will be just table stakes. So the companies that are really going to make it are the ones that differentiate beyond what is table stakes, but the ones who are going to lose really fast are the ones who don't even do the table stakes, who say, okay, this isn't for me. And the same is true for employees. Employees who say, I don't want to use this accelerator that will make me write code faster or design faster, they're going to just be slower than everyone else. So you have to understand that you have to do that.
Yeah, go ahead. No, you go.
I was going to say, I think, when I look from an enterprise business perspective, AI is a big cost saver, and that isn't not true. I think what you need to do as either the leader of the team or the person driving the work is you need to make a conscious choice of, are you building a feature or are you building an experience? And to me, an experience always has a quality metric to it, and that quality metric is always tied to the end user of that experience, right? So whether you're focused on adoption or the quality of the result, I think it's always making sure that metric is top of mind, and then what are the actions you're doing to drive that metric, and how are you making sure that the team that is responsible for driving that work is bought onto that metric and also following through on driving that quality. As you move further up in the organization, ideally you have senior leaders that are both caring about quality and also cost savings, but the reality is that some are very dialed into cost savings, and sometimes for very good reasons, right? And I think it's beholden onto the people creating the work to make sure that, like I said, you're creating an experience, not a feature.
Yeah. It's likely both will be true, but how do you maintain that tension? Like when you shift more to the quality side of the equation, and again, going back to the customer, because if the competition's focused on the customer and we're not, we got to probably move to that quality. The only way we're going to get quality data is through these kinds of approaches and not other things. So,
I know we've been talking about AI a lot, but also when the technology itself, like I think of AI as a key technology as an enabler for whatever product that we're designing or building. But technology, all the other technologies are moving and changing so quickly in the paradigms in which we're working, whether it's DevSecOps, whether it's, it's Python, whether it's Node, now I'm going to use React, Flutter. It's like there's a different language, there's a different something that is moving with different types of skills that are needed all the time. So it's making sure you do the due diligence in evaluating all of this to understand, like, what am I going to make? What is the goal? Are these technologies going to enable that for the long term, for the short term? Is it going to, can I afford it? Can I find the talent that can actually, that can be on my team? Can I hire them? So it's factoring all these decisions as you're creating these solutions.
yeah. So it's the true north that also helps you to maintain your sanity with all this change going on, because otherwise there's a lot of tool salesmen, just to kind of use that, a lot of tools there, but what's going to benefit the customer? And then how do I keep the culture of that? Because I think sometimes you start to see the culture be dismantled a bit sometimes when they see technology doing more than it's going to do. So that's always a challenge to say, we have to continue to focus on the customer and things like that. So, one of the conversations we had earlier, and I just kind of want to open up here, is the idea of, also with these technologies, you have the idea of younger engineers, younger designers, and we have often more experienced people, and maybe some hints at, and even some of the literature kind of talks about how more experienced people can also see the strengths and the weakness of the output of AI, or the strength of weakness of any tool that are there. But this question of how do we maintain the socialization of the young people they may rely on AI for whatever reason. How do you get them to have that intuition that they might need, that you may start to see still housed in a senior person who says, that's a good output, that's an output, we need to do it again. We need to run that experiment again. How are you thinking about that? Because sometimes the younger generation might be coming up a little bit differently.
For me, it comes down to the hiring process and the teams that are actually managing those people. So I think it's making sure you can find people that can collaborate well, that know how to mentor more of that sort of younger generation, or those up-and-comers that know how to work in a team, and they can see somebody struggling, or they haven't spoken up on Zoom, or they're not even showing up to meetings. How do you make sure that you're creating a positive work environment so everybody has a seat at the table and that they can, have their careers and grow? So I do, while we have all these tools, it's also about the people side and making sure that you can just develop those positive relationships moving forward for all of them.
Yeah. And I guess you're also seeing similar investments, because I think sometimes when tools come in, people can kind of step back from the culture. They can step back from the human side of it. It doesn't have to be the case, but sometimes there's that kind of, I'm intimidated. I got to figure this out, so I'm going to retreat to my corner and not think about it. But as our role as leaders, how do we keep people in that collective experience? How do we lower the heat around making mistakes, right? Because when you take on these new technologies, you're going to make mistakes. How do we make that feedback? This is a good prompt, a bad prompt. This is what I'm learning. This is how I'm getting better.
I think the senior people in the organization lead by example. So what we are seeing is people who, I'm seeing this, a lot of the senior people are using the tools more because, to your point, they can evaluate the output and they're more comfortable with it, but they lead by example of how to do it, and then they advertise it. Here's how I use the tool. Here's what it did well. Here's what it didn't do well. And then other people in the organization can follow suit, but it doesn't have to be the more senior people. Sometimes it can be at any level, somebody who's experimenting with these tools. And then you need to you need to socialize it. You need to have channels where people talk about it to say this is what worked and didn't work, so that everybody isn't repeat learning the same mistakes. And there's a lot of people who are interested. So there's a lot of hunger to use, at least from the engineering side. I see a lot of people are saying, hey, there's this new tool I read about, or my friend went to work at this company and we should try it out. So I think we need to get those in the hands of people fast. And the biggest barrier that we have right now is just passing through security.
And I just to piggyback on that, because my answer is much of the same, I think it's one, making sure that you are humble, right? So I think it's making sure that, most of, especially now that we're doing in AI, is still relatively new. So I think as a leader, but also part of your culture, you have to communicate and set expectation that this is new and there's some degree of rework and fail that's going to be inherent to what we're doing, so that when hiccups do happen, people don't feel like they need to hide it or feel ashamed. It is now a learning opportunity because we've all sort of agreed that it's new. Second is making sure that there's a forum to share that work in the open, whether it's a product review, UX review. I thought I grabbed it and I was like, product review, UX review. Somewhere where not just the core team, but the larger organization, where you have a forum where that senior or leader can work with that junior or new to the organization person to understand and see the work. And then 3, I think it's coaching your more experienced individuals to really explain their POV, right? So I think the challenge you have that you get more senior is a lot of things become intuitive. So you do a lot of things without explaining or communicating why. So I think it takes some coaching and effort to realize that, like, hey, in order for people to grow, especially when we're not all in conference rooms together, that we're home at Zoom and sometimes with the monitor off, we need to explain how did we arrive at this decision and what was the learning either from the research or from the test, so that people can grab onto those and internalize them and then play that back to the next round of work.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, this connection between, I have a professor friend, and he started using AI about a year ago and make sure all the students use it, because what he felt was there's no stupid questions. Because sometimes in a classroom, you don't want to ask that question, right? You only want to have the answer. You don't want to ask the question that reveals, I'm not sure what's going on. And what's interesting is, as he's been using it more and more, it creates this culture of revealing what you don't know. And now it bleeds over into the social environment of the physical classroom, whether virtual or not. But that's an interesting byproduct that we may not always leverage, is that there's no stupid questions with chat, right? I don't know about you. I spend a half hour with it pretty much every day, exploring things that are a struggle for me, because I don't know, something I've learned 10 things here this session. I'm going to go back and explore those things. How do you create that kind of exploratory and see it that way as a kind of a learning partner in this process? How do we help people? Because it makes it, are we seeing that? Are we doing that? I mean, that's part of the leadership challenge, but I guess we just got to keep doing that.
Yeah.
I also think it's about giving your teams the feedback. You mentioned coaching. I think coaching is really, really important. Making sure that you're giving feedback, you're working together, you're communicating why something didn't resonate or why they might have not done something the way that you wanted to. When we're in this sort of remote world, we kind of forget about doing that, and then it doesn't feel great for the person on the other side.
Yeah. Kind of back to the fragmentation or siloization that's kind of happened with remote work, and kind of a word that I think Jeff was using earlier in the earlier session. How do we let the work itself be front and center? And this question, the customer reminding them things like that. But how do you give feedback about, talk them through that process so they see it? I'm kind of wondering. This may create in some ways, we got to live by our principles. I think as people who do design work, people who do product development work, this is a chance for us to come reinvest in the things that we've always known, and then how do we use the AI to just, whether it's speed and quality, whatever the things that we try to manage with that. So, I mean, is this a new era? Do you see kind of a new era, and it's the firms that see it as a new era, not just as a cost cutting, not just as a smoothing out and things like that? How would you describe this era? What would be some ways to think about it?
I think it's really exciting. I think the tools that are coming in play is going to enable us to do so much more. And so every worker will be more productive, be able to do things faster. If you don't mind, on that note, I think one example of that is the partnership between Miro and Glean that was announced this morning that I'm really excited about. So as long as I'm up here, I'm taking an opportunity to tell you all. And I see Jeff here. We worked on this together, and that's an example of something with Miro. When you're using Miro, instead of having to go find the information, you just ask about a previous document or a previous product brief while you're in the brainstorm with people, and Glean will get that information. So when you look at not only the opportunities of individual products and how they're going to get you information, but then bringing the richness of multiple products that are platforms to surface AI in a way that a user doesn't even feel like they're using AI. They just feel like, okay, I'm in this environment, I have information that I'm seeking, and it's just there. That again, we're going to forget what it was like when we didn't have this, because we're going to get so used to working this way. So I love the partnership between Miro and Glean, and I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of these type of partnerships in general in the industry of bringing the information together.
And so maybe the question of, back to the, the workflow that is facilitated by, because if you can just grab the data, you can summarize it quickly, then you're not broken apart by a day's wait, or by you go to a different meeting, you get in a bad mood because it's a meeting about X, Y, and Z. But this idea of having that workflow match, in some ways I was thinking, actually during Jeff's conversation, that sometimes there's a huge separation between creativity and execution. And this idea, are we able to kind of close that gap? And whether it's discovery and design and delivery, that's often a larger, but in some ways it's full of miniature, small, create, execute. And that may be a way we can have this be a technological revolution that actually allows us to drive these experimentations faster. Where as designers, I think all of us on here are people who design for a living, but often there is such a long gap between creation and validation, creation and execution, creation and the business model being proven. And
Tighter loops is what you're saying. Prototyping and getting results, and whether it's when you're designing, like even just brainstorming, designing, implementing, those tighter loops are going to make us move faster.
Yeah, I think you were talking about, are we in a new era? I do think that the long cycles of maybe you had 12 weeks to do a discovery, I think we can't afford that anymore. I think that's really gone. I think now it's getting to product market fit quite quickly, making sure you understand the customer, and you have to do that probably, and you got to launch an alpha maybe in 3 months. So it's just all of a sudden everything has compressed, and we all have to learn how to work in those time frames. So using the tools to enable you, but also making sure you're not losing sight of the products and the things that you are creating.
So in some ways, as things are more compressed, that's kind of that era, but how do we keep the iterations sped up? There might also be, it's interesting in this kind of vision here, as you might actually think about, maybe there are other stakeholders that have historically not been pulled into these kind of conversations, right? Whether, as we think a lot about sustainability questions in design, those have been stakeholders who are farther outside, and maybe that's something we can pull them into these iterations. How do we, those things that you think about, that's, because design struggles a bit with sustainability questions, right? They tend to be farther out, stakeholders we don't always engage. Thoughts?
Yeah, I would say we have to do a lot of stakeholder management, especially in the enterprise space, and I think it's getting them to understand the value that it's going to have back to their organization and business quite quickly. How do they realize this investment that they're spending? Is it going to be whether it's, what is the ROI in getting to that quite quickly? When you can prove that to them, they can make decisions a lot quicker. But if you leave it kind of ambiguous, it's sometimes hard to get that stakeholder buy-in. So I think it's bringing all those decision makers in, especially in a matrixed organization, to understand that this is going to get their business further to outlast the startups, or at least stay alongside of those startups.
Because I even think about working in cities, in government, because they often struggle with this from creation to execution, right? How do we deploy this kind of approach to pull those stakeholders, whether citizens or people who manage things like that? So, well, we're getting closer to the end, and so maybe just want to kind of go with what would be your career advice that you would offer people here? But maybe, Jonah, I can start with you a little bit about what are the characteristics of maybe the people who make up your teams that are the people who are able to ride this kind of highly iterative way where it's intensely learning new things, but also highly collaborative. Is there a certain kind of skill we should have, or a makeup, or people we should look for?
Adaptability. When we're talking to candidates and we're talking to people, it's, are they adaptable? Because as I mentioned, technology changes so quickly, so can they evolve? Do they have a positive sort of a team environment, sort of spirit about them? Because culture is important, I believe, in cultivating great teams. I think those are two things. If they can learn, they can adapt, they can work with others, that is key to having a successful career in this space.
So as you think about the people you look for, but even kind of advice for a successful career in this highly dynamic world we live in.
I mean, right now, I think design is a tight market, right? So there are organizations that are downsizing their design teams. There are many designers that are looking for work. So I think those that are working are looking at, the mundane time savings that AI and innovation might provide. On one hand, it's great because designers don't want to spend their time doing mundane stuff. On the flip side, some of that mundane stuff is, what is sustaining designers and product managers and etc. So I think in that scenario, for me, it's, critical thinking. I think we should and will get to a point where all that mundane stuff isn't where we should be spending our time, right? What is actually valuable is what you do once you've got all the research and all the explorations, and that you understand the business and how to apply your understanding of, how customers navigate and what they need to that research and exploration you've done.
Yep.
So I think it's that critical thinking skill that is really the thing that's going to drive design and all the things that fall under that forward.
Great, thanks. Tomorrow we have about 30 seconds and we'll do a quick wrap.
The thing I would add, it's a yes and, is curiosity. Is being, to your adaptability, being curious about what's out there. Go back to what I said is you all should be using the AI tools that you have in your organization, so try them out and have an opinion and write about it. Like show, especially if you're looking for a job, like write publicly about here's the tools that I used. Try and fine-tune your old model. You don't have to be technical to do it. Anyone can do it. You can ask ChatGPT how to do it. So just be curious with the new technology that's there and try and figure out how to use it and what will be used in the future so that you're getting ahead of the trends.
Great, thank you. So I think in some ways with these last three words, how do we role model as managers, leaders, right? Adaptability, critical thinking, and this curiosity. That's our roles to kind of role model that on our teams, particularly with the young who are growing up in maybe a different starting point. But at the same time, I wanted to thank Miro for convening this panel and having us come together, because I think a lot of the spirit, what we saw this morning, was this question of, not how do you let the work itself be there? So the curiosity just flows. The adaptability is encouraged. The critical thinking happens in a way where we iterate quickly with it, and a visual medium is always very helpful for that. So, all right, thanks everyone, and it's a wrap.